All right. Well, welcome, Shingai and George and Gary. Um, we start with hearing about last week and yeah, what happened last week or how did it go?
Yeah, I guess I can start. So this is actually from 2 weeks ago. I didn't make it to the meeting last week. Don't know if anyone else did.
I
Um,
didn't either.
yeah, and I'll just say that I had a sense that it would be on me to lead the meeting, but I wasn't 100% sure, so I didn't prepare. So I'll acknowledge that I felt very like underprepared and somewhat underqualified for leading the meeting. So it felt a little bit chaotic and like things got off track. But I think one important takeaway that I got was I got some very helpful perspectives on how other members think about crypto and blockchain ecosystems. I feel pretty confident that blockchain-based systems are really great candidates for systems analysis. And so I was able to take in people's concerns and incorporate that into how I'm thinking about the right approach to applying George's systems analysis process to blockchain-based systems. And I'll just mention that, George, I've started going through chapter 6, and I am applying your framework directly to an analysis of Bitcoin. And it's proving very, very fruitful so far.
Oh, great. I'm eager to hear the results,
Absolutely. Yeah.
the progress. We might not get results for a while.
Awesome. Well, nice work, slash report, Shingai. I didn't intend for anyone in specific because I didn't know who would join. So I'm glad that you could take it in that way. And it sounds very interesting. Glad to see that there's notes.
Yeah, Jessie showed up. I don't know that she's ever attended one of these Thursday meetings.
Mm.
I believe the time after slash during the language model, the great language model bull run of May or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. This kind of systemness with the whole proof of stake, proof of work, just to give one even small example, block size within Bitcoin and how much of this should, like those kind of parametric level discussions when they're not grounded in the systemsness, it's very partial. You know, is the ecosystem going to be healthier if it's a warmer one or colder one? But that may be very tied up with all these different things. So the real value is in supporting it, but that's not everything, but that's what has to support the value.
One more comment, George, the book you mentioned about the origin and nature of life on Earth, I would love to hear more about your major takeaways from that book and sort of in a very practical sense, how we could go about studying this process using your framework. I don't think I completely caught it during the meeting.
Okay. Yeah. It's it has to do with applying the systems analysis process to the origin of life problem.
Mm-hmm.
I had that's the one thing I actually have continued to be working on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, uh, I don't know if I can say a whole lot about it right now. What I've been doing is playing around with diagramming core metabolism as a set of work processes and how they're coupled. And I just ran across something this morning that I was not. Gary, you might be familiar with it. This is the first time I'd run into it. It's called electron bifurcation, and
Hmm.
it's a. Have you heard of that, Gary?
Heard of it, yeah.
it's a means of coupling an exergonic reaction with an endergonic reaction, with the result being the minimization of the weight of conversion of free energy to waste heat. And so that's kind of where I am right now, because that's a really critical issue in the coupling of processes within a system, is making sure that we always think of it as basically not wasting energy, or energy optimization, or whatever. Pardon me. But so I'm kind of excited about following up on that in the next few days. But it's the origin of life is a critical phase transition for the universe, and it's one of those tough nuts that still hasn't been cracked from the top down. That is, what Morowitz and Smith are doing is analyzing metabolism as we find it today in bacteria and archaea, and then trying to take it apart, figure out what the most essential parts of it are, and then try to figure out what the chemical, physical aspects would have been that led to those sort of core, what they call the core set of reactions that then became the autocatalytic cycles that a chemical evolution process could have then begun to refine. And I think it would be to me, it looks like some aspect of it could be, a PhD dissertation research project to start with, to start applying systems analysis to that problem. And then that would expand into a larger research agenda for someone who wanted to, carry it forward. But boy, would it be a powerful way for the idea of systems science to make a contribution to an important problem that is already multidisciplinary in nature, and has a lot of interest and a lot of significance for the evolution on this planet.
One question, maybe this is like a bit of a simple question, but would doing this sort of research at some stage require work in a laboratory? So like biology, chemistry, like running experiments that attempt to recreate some of those dynamics that
Well, what I have in mind would not necessarily, because a lot of that work has already been done. We know what most of the chemistry is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we understand an awful lot about it. What it would be is trying to put it in the framework of a system. I mean, they already use that language, but they haven't explicitly said, these are the components, or these are the subsystems of a larger system. And they haven't used that framing per se. They've used the chemical physical framing that is fairly traditional in biochemistry. And so it would be more or less a process of showing how that language of biochemistry translates into the language of systems. Mm-hmm. And then with the ultimate goal being maybe that systems approach would give insights as to what the most fundamental biochemistry, or what was geochemistry initially converted into or transitioned into biochemistry. And this would be a way of assisting, so to speak, that field. And it would generate hypotheses and ideas about where to look next. And then the biochemists and um, all of those guys who do that kind of laboratory work would then have an idea of what to do, how to come up with a new set of experiments, perhaps. So I look at it more as a overarching, understand the whole framework, provide guidance to the lower level actual experimental work.
Mm-hmm.
That
Absolutely.
makes any sense at all.
It does, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm wondering if you imagine that sys XML and systems language would provide useful like simulation and computational analysis tools that would like assist them in their work,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah, I do. Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, Gary's got that book too, so he's been promising to dig into it.
Yeah.
It just reminds me of the closing. I'll copy this in. Just about the origins life. The classic final paragraph of Darwin. Originally breathed into a few forms or into one. So that even that kind of pluralism and just like where are you gonna the cleanliness of the categorization is going to be about the modeler's perspective and perspective integration. Like when you actually find it to be life and whether that how many totally non-overlapping extant forms could have existed before even that. There's a lot of really fundamental questions and a lot of assumptions about climate science on the planet. A lot, so it's definitely a big area. But then on the empirical side, it made me think of like if you do the systems analysis and you can create some cell, a living cell, with some or no or little resilience, but show that it's smaller than the group that's doing the knockout path. So they're sweeping knockouts from a certain already small organism. And so if it can be shown that a bottom-up approach to system closure and the kind of Robert Rosen approach or the principles approach, or just any of the other things, but basically get all of these kind of like systems, living systems, all of these things that people emphasize, like definitely a graduate school work, like you said, George, to bring that together. And then on all the domain specific work, like where do we have measurements of this? And then be able to make something that's going to bring both sides to that discussion.
You know, one thing that occurred to me, and Xinghai, I don't think we've ever discussed this before. But one of the things that systems science and this process of deep analysis and so forth brings to the table is I don't know that I call it a unification, but basically it brings abductive reasoning fully to the front of process of finding out things. Because one of the things you have to do is you look at a phenomena, you look at it after you've mapped it out and you say, well, what was necessary? What would explain how this got to be this way? What was the necessary inputs? So in the process of deep analysis, indicate you start with the outputs,
Mhm.
work backwards toward the inputs. And that is a kind of parallel abduction. You're looking at multiple pathways simultaneously. But you have, in order to explain the output, you have to really understand um, the kinds of inputs that are necessary to do that. Not just the flow inputs, but also what is present within the subsystem that's actually producing that output.
Hmm.
So the notion of the various forms of logic of deduction, induction, and now abduction all play a role in how that process works itself out.
Okay, okay, that's helpful. I think that's actually the first time I've come across the term abductive reasoning. So that's helpful context.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Gary, wanna add anything?
No, no, I'm tired and I'm listening.
Okay. Yeah, there's just one thing that I'll connect it to. I think this is a great point, George. Um, this is a series of live streams, but that's the background one. The paper was on active inference and abduction from 2021. And
Huh.
it's very provocative and interesting, and also like one of the first author here is a real Pierce expert, and that's just Sis Pierce's semiosis and like the relationship with pragmatism and all the depth of the semiosis that then like oriented abduction occurs within, and he was well informed on induction, deduction, strengths and weaknesses, and abduction is like the forgotten third voice in such a funny way. And then to connect that to sumo, suggested upper merged ontology by Adam Peace. So that ontology differs from other ontologies because its declarations are actually axioms that are written like Lisp programs, and then they're checked with a theorem prover like Vampire. So it's not like just a declarative like relational database, because a lot of ontology systems are just labeling nodes and edges. But then the semantic work of the labeling is implicit. Like the column meaning barrels per year, and the fact that barrels per year, that is just semantic in interpretation rather than through formal enforcement. But also using it to detect internal inconsistencies of that static knowledge base, or using it to suggest new axioms. So it's a like ontology guided abduction. It one way of saying it is it presumes these because it deals with both universal and existential qualifiers and modal logic and other forms. So it's like it's more general than the other two. They're not really like alternatives to each other. And it's obviously in play in development and learning and novelty. So like, and causal inference and super obvious cognitive phenomena. So why continue to try to shoehorn things into being like parts and wholes and generalizations and specifications, which is like important, but not the process by which that's selected by agent.
Very true.
There's probably been work on abduction in systems a lot, maybe some of the more I just don't know, or we don't need to look it up right now, but
Well, I seem to recall Rosen did have some treatment of abduction when he was talking about recursion or backward recursion or something like that. It's a vague memory. He was one of the few, besides people like George Clear, he was one of the few that actually worked with the logics that I'm familiar with.
Totally agree. I think in the future we'll hopefully be able to know more with the kinds of citations and language and everything. But Rosen was recognized just anecdotally for being like decades ahead on logical and the category theoretic, which developed on like the more general work. For example, Kant saying that the organism is like the end in and of itself, and the autopoiesis, which focused on the self-organization. But those are just qualitative stances that just describe self-creation. And Rosen, though I have not read all the details, actually was kind of working on these open system closures that George is talking about.
Right, right.
We could look at a recent Systems Explorers post. We could, Gary, if you wanted to talk about anything or the education initiatives or anything.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to disturb the flow of what you're going through. Yeah.
That's all good.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mentioned this to George when I had a chat with him the other day, but I was at the INCOSE conference in Hawaii a month ago, and I participated in a panel on scientific foundations for systems engineering, and as a result of that engagement, quite a few educators came up to me afterwards and expressed an interest in what I was talking about. And what I also did is I went to see all of the educators who were who had booths at the conference. So universities and also professional organizations like PPI, for instance. And I started to have a conversation with them about their existing modules and approaches to incorporating systems thinking and system science into their education. And what we started to talk about was the potential to have a common core that they could all refer to and then differentiate from in their training material. So we've set up an event on the 29th of August, and we've invited about 25 or so different educators to attend. Christopher Chase is going to do a talk on the utilization of art in teaching science, system science in particular. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and get them all to work together on 3 or 4 common slides and supporting text and key references, which they will all then refer to in their systems engineering and systems management education. So that's what's going on the 29th. I sent out the invite a few days ago after explaining this to the board. And you know, Daniel, myself, and Jen McCarr discussed this a couple of weeks ago. So Daniel's already involved in this. But what we're hoping to do is from that engagement, then start to actually instantiate the education committee that we're supposed to have in the ISSS, which is intended to include the core of which is the educators, and the VP for Comms and Education would be the co-chairman of that. So that's what's going on from an education perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and obviously a lot of it hasn't happened, but this committee consists of only ISSS members, or how do you see the partnerships or the relationships with the education? Is this all ISSS effort?
No. So the whole intent of several of our committees is that the ISSS facilitates them. So there's the appropriate VP, maybe a couple of members who, well, there are interested members who can obviously attend, but the main influx of the attendees is the education bodies. Yeah, and we act as a facilitator, and that's our role. It's the same for the publications committee. The publications committee is intended to be made up of editors from systems orientated journals.
Shingai or George, just feel free to add your thoughts or add a question.
Well, Gary, what do you see as the relationship between what we've been doing under Daniel's leadership and what you're talking about proposing here?
Well, one of the reasons why I'm here is to find out more about it. So I attended a couple of sessions at the beginning when Daniel kicked this off, but I haven't, apologies, but I haven't been involved for quite some time.
Well, I'll shoot first. I'm looking forward to getting more energy and education organizationally and as the real research. Like, my activity will remain on a similar order of magnitude going forward, but that's going to be like 100th to 1000th, because this is just so massively participatory. And so I don't plan nor feel expected to do anything further than be a co-chair in a community that's motivated and collaborative, and have somebody who's more of a dedicated project manager to really make things work with deliverables on timeline, maintain all the updates, and all these other things that this kind of initiative I feel like needs. I'm happy to be there and tie it to the ISSS and system science and give my input as a participant. So that entire production of educational materials would not be the only project of such a committee. This is not a single project, single deliverable. It's hosted by this education, hopefully, long-term commitment by people to the education committee. One project would be production of educational materials. Another topic could be ontology fusion. There could be several projects, some of which the seeds already we have, so we should donate them over. And then Shingai and George, you may find some aspects of the work are relevant to host under that committee, and you may just want to do your own collaborations just as colleagues in the systems ecosystem. So at that point, then we could just chill and talk. I'd be happy to speak with any of you. Maybe have a monthly education ISS office or open hour for education research. And so instead of a faster pace that makes people think that they're expected to do projects in this context, which they're not, but then have just 12, plan it out the whole year in advance, or have 12 or so just education open house, talk about ISSS education initiatives, have the committee there, get feedback from the community, present works in progress, iterate, get feedback. So just have more of an education open space, and then education committee with educational materials as a project under that committee.
Yeah. A couple of extra things as well, just to build on what you're saying, Daniel. So we do have an education SIG as well. And I'm not sure how active that is, but that must in some way also play a part in this. The other thing that's worth knowing is, so I think George, you're familiar, or you've heard of the Future of Systems Engineering initiative. That includes one pillar, which is the foundations of systems engineering. But in COSI, you have another initiative, which is called SYSTEAM. Yeah, system, science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. Yeah, and that initiative is led by Caitlin Singham, who's a PhD student at, I think, Maryland. She's going to be attending the event on the 29th. But that SYSTEAM initiative already has, a lot of people participating in it, and it's definitely complementary to, what we're proposing. They have a lot of what Caitlin said to me is they have a lot of practitioners, but they have very little theorists. Yeah. And, George and I have discussed this, that, the strength of the ISSS historically has been, theorists rather than practitioners. I think that balance has changed a bit, but yeah. So Caitlin might actually make a good chair for this.
Well, one of the things that we've been kind of implicitly, if not sometimes explicitly discussing in these Thursday meetings, is that it would be a good idea to come to resolution on what the content of systems science is before you start teaching stuff. Because as it stands right now, there's just this wide array of this system theory, and I'm not talking about general system. I'm talking about, just theories about systems. And they're all over the place. Some of them are contradictory with one another. Many of them, I will say, at least in my experience, are internally inconsistent. So they have problems because they're very loosely developed. And if all you do is just take all this potpourri and say, okay, here's this theory, and here's this theory, and here's this theory, and that's the educational program, we're not going to make any progress whatsoever. We're not going to get anywhere because that's what we've been doing. That's already what we've been doing. So I think one of the things that I had hoped for what Daniel has started here is that we would focus on how do we come up with a consistent, concise, theoretical framework to build then curriculum around. And then you can start talking about how you employ that to educate people. But if we're just going to put a bunch of stuff together and say, there it is, that ain't going to work.
Yeah, no, I agree. It has to be organized as a system. And that system itself has to be founded on general systems theory.
Yeah, I'll just add. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Please. No, go for it.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like the work that we've been doing around a systems language and SysXML is very much related to this. And I'll just say that I've been getting a lot of interest over the past couple of weeks from people in the blockchain, crypto economic system space, both on the sort of mathematical and theoretical side from some engineers, and also on the more applied side from developers who are interested in accessible modeling tools that they could use with a nice visual interface. And so a priority for me is making our vision and a summary of what we have so far really accessible. So I've started 2 repositories on GitHub, and a priority for me is to just take all this information we have and boil it down in a way that makes it easy for people to get involved, because I have a lot of really smart, really cool people who seem eager to collaborate. and they've been asking for documentation, and we don't really have it. So I'm working on that.
Yeah. Yes, if you were showing some diagrams just a moment ago, Daniel. If you could bring those back up. Yeah, so you see the circular one with the steps in the I think it's the analysis and the design of systems. Yeah, is that right, George?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look
It's
at
chapter 5, I think.
that one, yeah. If you look at that one there, yeah. So if you relate that to the relational holon, John Kinnaman's work, and his what he describes in A Guide to Systems Research, you can found that diagram in the relational model. Yeah.
Well,
Gary, I'm going to kind of challenge you to explain that more. You're basically saying we can do this with this, and they go together. I'm a little bit familiar with John's work, so I'm
yeah. So John's work is based on Rosen's. Yeah. And for instance, he has a par holon, which he relates to the research activity itself. So, for instance, I don't know if you've got a copy of this book. Yeah, but the par holon, he describes it in terms of it maps to a number of quadrant patterns. Yeah, so he has reflect, observe, act, and plan. Yeah, the planning and the reflection are the contextual system, and the observant and act is in the actual system. Yeah. Now you can relate that diagram directly to that quadrant.
To what quadrant?
I have to turn my background off.
almost like it would be helpful to have a systems model that captured perception, action, and cognitive systems.
No.
Yeah, well, I think if you see, this is the large view. Each one of those ovals can be further decomposed.
Yeah.
To show those components.
Yes.
The
because,
arrows that are pointing inward are basically going to perceptual internal processes.
Yeah, each one of those subsystems is also a system in its own right.
Yes.
Yeah. So, we discussed the other day, George, perhaps signaling is not the right word, but messaging, the building of information, and then the act of energy, I'll use your term, energy, manipulating mass, which then results in new messaging.
So one of the things that needs to be done is we take that diagram as a starting point and then take each of just follow the procedure that I gave in chapter 5.
Well,
take that diagram and take each of those subsystems and decompose it in the exact same way. And you will find all of the sub-processes that go to make up. Now, for example, in the knowledge base, there's a whole chapter that talks about what are the components within that knowledge base, but it doesn't talk about how stuff gets in or how stuff gets out.
Yeah.
Right?
The thing is about that diagram is it's about the human activities, the human processes. Yeah. Those human processes are actually an enactment of natural processes which are performed simply through physics. Yeah. And that's what John describes in his relational holon.
Let me add another angle here. So there's a lot of generalizations, abstractions about thermodynamics, information, and quantum. We're not even going to go into it, but I believe those are just natural scientific descriptions and models, and active inference has far more detail than a lot of other models. Just to say that. But more importantly is what the committee can do that will basically be like thriving and productive. Only speaking as I see it, like what I would as like a pre-post-mortem. Here's what would be dissatisfying to me, because I surely resonate with George's sentiment and respect what you've shared. What would be a negative outcome would be people's time is consumed, and whether it ends acrimoniously or not, we get some new splashboards, some new lists, some quibbling about order, but some order is presented. Some words are included on some lists, some edges are labeled, some no's are labeled, parts are contradictory or not. It just is a common resource that then doesn't find adoption, that motivated graduate students don't find like it's relevant to help co-organize and scaffold the service, or organizations don't feel like it's worthwhile to have people like contribute their time into this open source commons. Just to be really clear, there's a lot of things that I think the committee could do, many of which, first off, I'm more than open to how everyone else in this meeting thinks, but I don't see how that synthesis work can happen for even two people in a finite period of time. So I clearly what we're going to walk out of there with is like a plan for coming towards understanding. Is it going to be consensus of whether this, or is it, vetoes at a Quaker meeting? So clearly we're not going to walk out of there with deliverable slides, anything more than like a little memento. What the committee could do is commit to the system scientific analysis and say, we are going to have this like meta angle where if you want to talk about ontology fusion, we have that project in the committee, but we are working with this systems process in bootstrapping this committee. And again, if you want to fuse it with your own ontology and like go on the meta like that, we have a research group or a SIG, or we have another project in the committee, like to connect this model to the Holon and to the free energy principle and all these other things. Valuable directions, but wrong system of interest. And then facilitate the project to be like, we're going to be dealing with a lot of different stakeholders and input. We're not a research team doing ontology fusion. I know that means that we're not going to be using or working exactly as everyone has ever expected or seen before. However, surely you understand why this is an important aspect of our work. It's going to be also a great time, very productive. People will make leverage contributions. Systems will be high reliability. People will trust it, which means that they will use it, and that will make the ecosystem positive. But also, of course, you see that if we just go ad hoc here, even from the beginning, especially from the beginning, it's going to be just like any other conversation about systems that just ends up with whether a nested Markov blanket sequence is like an omni something or the other.
Yeah, I mean, one thing well, maybe you do. I mean, this diagram you're showing here, George, I know you refer to the basis of this as your system principles, but what is the tracing of those system principles to that diagram?
Well, that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
The principles book outlines a set of attributes of systems, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a starting point. If you wanted, I could take each one of those, or the whole of that, which is basically a learning process. Daniel said it himself. I could actually demonstrate how active inference works in the framework of the guidance of the analysis phase being based on the existing knowledge base, so that you're basically you've got a Bayesian learning system in that everything that you do by following the procedures outlined in the chapter 5, I think it is, the methodology of analysis, you improve, you gain, you refine the knowledge base itself. So I, I I don't know if that answers your question, but basically, I assure you the various principles. Also, we can invoke other principles. This is just an outline of the core process. It's like I was talking about core metabolism. It's modified over time through evolution, but it's really a core. What's elaborated is what's outside that, which is what could this particular process do in terms of, after analyzing systems, could it then contribute to the design of better tools, a better, used in the engineering context, would it result in better artifacts and so forth? And this is what I really try to show throughout the entire book, Gary.
Yeah. I was just trying to pin you down in terms of which principles are associated with each of these steps. I mean, I can see, for instance, a clear relationship between knowledge base and at least one of the principles. Which principle would be most associated with analysis?
Let me just speak to that. It's not just what George described. I believe in one of the pieces that Shingai and I, like, both with a background in open source dynamical systems modeling, understand, like, from the CAD side, is like what George points to with ISSSS XML. So that is what takes it far, far beyond just like a synthesis or a take, is even the primed directive to develop just, it's a file, we call it XML or it's just a file type, but that's a methodological path forward with the cognitive strategies and attention strategies, which are described in teaching strategies, and then the systems itself. And if somebody looks at this and then they think, like, there's a missing section or there's an edge, it shouldn't be there, this is just a schematic. But if there's another section, add it and make it happen consistently. Otherwise, I don't believe we're going to have, like, accessible or inclusive or effective teams at all, because without something on the table and people making explicit, and then also everything has systemness because it's just a take. It's like, it described the funny part about anything. It's and the methods provided, which is what takes this beyond aesthetics. And that's the whole point of system science, as George's textbook, I believe, represent it, is that the aesthetic element is transmuted, not used as merit.
So Gary, take one of the principles is that systems, sufficiently complex systems, have models of themselves.
Yeah.
By model there, we're talking about something that is dynamic and itself a simulation of what's going on. Well, that top oval there is the governance structure. And if you read my treatment of what a governance structure, governance architecture actually is and how it works, you would find that is the incorporation of that principle into this model, as just one example.
Yeah, I'll just say that from my perspective, like, it's clear that there are a lot of different moving parts that are scattered throughout George's work. So you have the principles, you have the ontology, you have the mathematical framework. And I think unless you take the time to read a lot of it, then it can be hard to sort of put it all together. I did give a presentation where I sort of explored this concept of a systems language, and I tied together the ontology, which is derived from the principles, and then I tied that to the mathematical framework, and then I tied that to the systems language in ISSSS XML. Gary, I would love to set up a meeting where I could give you a revised version of that presentation to get your feedback, because, yeah, it's obvious to me that we need to do a better job of showing, like, how all this is connected, and what's the clear, how do the principles get us to this process of deep systems analysis? How do all pieces fit together? We can do a better job of that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And to connect it to the core, that's what this group is a coming together of. It's of course not plausible to generate that agreeably licensed, agreeably governed, beautiful visual artifact. But starting the canvases and the relationships is huge, which is why I'm very excited for it. And I don't think there would be a more prepared group than people who want to make system science accessible and rigorous and applicable. So I believe it should be the group with the most motivation and context and capacity, though potentially not availability, but that's always a challenge. And so it should be possible. And I really look forward to it. And I applaud the effort a lot, Gary. And I see how much you're kind of like reaching out on the edges to make it happen. Because until it happens, it still is just people converging on a spot where no one's been per se, though in spirit it's been tried. And I think a big question is going to be like, what now, and how do we actually make it work and persist, and how to support even sense making of all those discussions and prevent there from being just like a fractal backroom situation that displeases rigor-minded people, which tunes them out, and then they don't feel included in the project. And so having like the beginner and different experts and recognizing diversity and all that, which I feel like systems does as well. But it's a big project, and I'm really glad that you're approaching it in a really like urgent way with your role.
Yeah, coming back to analysis, George, I mean, one candidate I think would be Systems Evolve, Principle 6.
Mhm.
When I look at the description of that, I think we could say that analysis is certainly underpinned by Principle 6. I think that might be a worthwhile activity, because I think I mean, this is just from my perspective. Yeah, you know, underneath that diagram, you say that the diagram is formed from the principles, but having a clear relationship of each of those subsystems with the principles, I think would help to make a connection.
Yeah, that no doubt. I would point out, though, that the whole first book, Principles of System Science, is we outline what the principles are, and then throughout the rest of the book, we show specific aspects of that at work. There's a whole chapter on evolution. It's really it's from my perspective, it's already there. Yeah. I think what you want is a slide that basically shows all that. And I'm telling you, that's not going to happen. That's not possible, because it's not a simple subject to begin with. There are many, as Shanghai said, there are many moving parts, and it takes time and practice. You actually have to do some of this stuff. Shanghai's working on applying this to blockchain and crypto currencies and so forth. So he's getting actual exercise in working on it. In the education framework, you would assign problems to students and say, all right, based on what you know from this textbook, how would you go about applying this principle to this system, and so on. So, I mean, here's the impression that I have built up over the years in ISSS is there are an awful lot of us who like to talk, and we like to make diagrams, slides, give slideshows, talk in generalities, basically, sort of paint pictures. But that's not the same thing as doing the science, so to speak. It's not the same thing as actually digging into the details and working through the problems in reality. So it's not something that's going to just pop out in a simple kind of slide. I've maintained for a long time, Gary, and you've heard me say this before, when you're doing systems work, you cannot focus on one aspect or even just two aspects. For example, when you're looking at governance architecture, you can't just think about cybernetics and even second order cybernetics. You have to expand, you have to understand the network architecture. You have to understand the hierarchical architecture. You have to understand the dynamics. You have to understand the evolution. All of those simultaneously, right? It's just not going to be a simple pattern of things that we can, throw on a slide.
I just would like to throw in. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, give closing thoughts.
Yeah, just like a question. So thinking about like which principle can be connected to that diagram showing the analysis process, could it be principle 11, which says that systems can be understood?
Yeah, that applies also.
Yeah.
Always in play.
All of them apply.
It's like temperature, mass, PV, NRT, but this is one of the true classics for image memes, because like we see people holding out the hours because they don't have the 2 minutes, and that's cart before the horse, and system science needs to do and be and aim better at its core. All right, thank you, fellows. Farewell.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice